Hey folks, you're listening to KSAV Radio. We're taking a nostalgia trip with interviews from some of music's TV and film favourites. Ready to reminisce? Let's flash back with Wes Britton.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Flashback, and we're going back into the misty periods of time past. Really going back on this episode, we're going back to the Old West. We haven't done that in quite a long time. But before we do that, I got one little bit of housekeeping to do. Our first interview tonight is going to be with Bruce Scivally, who I've interviewed before back in the old Dave White Presents show. And we did interviews with him about Superman and Batman. He's also written books about Matt Helm and James Bond and all kinds of superheroes like that. And right now, if you go to the Remember When podcast page, you can hear my interview with Bruce when we talked about Superman. And man, we touched every stone there is on Superman. So that's something to check out. And it won't be too long before we put this interview there at the Remember When podcast page. So that's the housekeeping. So let me shut up now and bring it on, Bruce.
Thank you, Wesley.
Well, I just mentioned a few minutes ago that you wrote all of these books about superheroes, Superman, Batman, James Bond, Matt Helm, all of that. Why did you switch gears and one, go back to the Old West, and two, for the first time, give us a novel instead of a nonfiction study?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to shorten it for you. I grew up in North Alabama, and when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, a lot of what you had on TV then were Westerns.
Oh, yeah.
It's of Westerns. I mean, Gunsmoke was still running, Bonanza was still running.
Yeah.
And I loved The Lone Ranger, so I really love those old Western movies and always have. And, after doing all these other sort of books on pop culture and so on, over the past few years, I've turned my attention more to just script writing. And I had written a script about Wyatt Earp that sort of focused on his very last days, because that's something we don't really hear much about or see much about in films. So I wanted to do something other than the Tombstone story. So I wrote this screenplay. It won quite a few contests and a lot of awards, and the ones that didn't win, first place, second place, so on. So I decided during the pandemic, it might be a good idea, since people were responding to this. And every time I post a win on Facebook, someone would say, I want to read this, or they thought it was a movie already and say, I want to see this. So I thought, since a lot of people were responding to this, and I've always wanted to write a novel, that this might be the one to take on and do that with. So that's what I did. I converted the screenplay into a novel. And in the course of doing that, of course, had to expand the story quite a bit, because the screenplay doesn't have all the backstory information that the book has. And I will have to say, for that, I relied on two sources that were essential to me. I read quite a few books on Wyatt, but one in particular was Casey Tiefer-Tiller's, just called Wyatt Earp, The Life Behind the Legend. And that is just an authoritative book on Earp, and I'd recommend anyone who's interested in Wyatt Earp to read that. And the other one was a book about his wife called Lady at the OK Corral by Ann Kirshner, just a story of Josephine Marcus Earp, who Wyatt called Sadie. So that was kind of what led into it, just my love of Westerns, and working on the script and the book for a couple of years gave me a great excuse to go back and rewatch all the old Westerns and discover some new ones I'd missed, and listen to a lot of Ennio Morricone music. And it was just really like being in heaven for 2 years.
There, that script includes Wyatt Earp's last dream. There sure is a dreamlike quality to your book, because a lot of the story is told in flashbacks and in dreams, right?
Yes, it is. It's sort of framed by the story of his wife, his doctor, and a biographer waiting by his bedside during the night. And what kind of spurred the whole story is, and all the research I was doing, because I wanted to write something about Wyatt Earp, and it was going to be a different story to begin with, and much bigger and more of an adventure. But as I got into it, I just read that Wyatt's last words were suppose, suppose. And it got me thinking, what was he supposing? What was he thinking about, as he was dying? And it just felt to me that, had just turned 80 years old. It's 1929. It's Los Angeles, a very different world than the Old West. But I thought, how would this Old West, sometimes lawman, prefer to go out rather than just passing away as an old man in his bed? So that led me into this kind of traditional Western story that he dreams about, where his dying during the night and that dream sort of come together at the end.
A good bit of this book deals with his relationship with Josephine and Sadie, however you want to call her. How accurate has history been with Josephine? She's been converted into lots of different kinds of characters over the years. Of course, she did a lot of that herself.
Yes, she was definitely doing some of her own myth making, and with Wyatt too. And she was really sort of the force behind him getting a biography written. Initially, they hired a guy who'd been their accountant named John Flood, who they initially hired to help with their mining ventures in California. And he wrote a book about Wyatt's exploits based on interviews he'd done with Wyatt, which just didn't fly because it was very poorly written and very florid in its language and kind of amateurish. So that didn't work. It was rejected by a lot of publishers. And then there were a couple of other people who wrote about him or wrote books that talked about Tombstone. And then eventually, right at the end of his life, he hooked up with Stuart Lake, who wrote the book called Frontier Lawman, Frontier Marshal.
Frontier Marshal, yeah.
Frontier Marshal. And that was the basis for pretty much all of the movies that came about, that brought Wyatt Earp into the public attention in the 1930s through the 50s, because he was also one of the producers of the TV series. But I mean, when he died, Wyatt wasn't the pop culture figure he is now. He was mostly forgotten. But it was that book that really put him into the public arena, and the movies based on it.
The one set piece in the book was unavoidably the OK Corral. Did you have a hard time dealing with that particular scene? Because it's been looked at and looked at and looked at and looked at so many times in so many ways over the decades.
And that's where I really have to take my hat off to Casey Tiefertiller, because his book goes into even more detail than what I do in my novel. I mean, I'd kind of done the Cliff Notes version of it based on what he'd wrote about. And, it's one of those things where the way it's always portrayed in the movies is just kind of a simple vengeance, revenge kind of thing with the Clantons, and Paul Clanton particularly. But when you read about the real story, it's much more involved in that. There's, the politics of the time that get involved with it, and the whole East versus West kind of culture clash, and this little cow town that had grown up to be this gambling mecca and so on in the course of just a couple of years. So there's an awful lot going on there and a lot of elements that play into it. And then I just tried, in going from Tiefertiller's book, to recast it and tell it as much as I could from Wyatt's point of view more, instead of just a factual approach. So I had to kind of put myself in Wyatt's shoes. But in the screenplay, I didn't get into that at all. It's kind of referred to in passing a couple of times in dialogue. But I tried as long as I could to do the story without retelling the gunfight at the OK Corral. But eventually, I felt like if people were going to read the novel, not everyone would be as familiar with it as you or I might be. So I needed to put that in.
I thought you did a pretty good job. You're right. A Cliff Notes version is pretty much the story, and it's part of the book that's straight ahead narrative. You don't have any of the dreamlike flourishes or flashback flourishes. How should we remember Wyatt Earp? You can't really call him a heroic figure, although he had his moments. Pretty complex individual, wasn't he?
He was a very complex individual, and so was Josephine. And again, these were people who I think, well, the way I saw them, they were kind of always on the look for the easy buck. Because they kind of went from sort of mining town to mining town, or wherever there was a little boom and bust kind of thing going on. And as Wyatt would say, he wanted to mine the miners. So he'd go into the mining town. Instead of being a miner, he would set up a saloon. And and play Pharaoh and deal cards and that sort of thing to get the miners money after they've been paid off. So yeah, they were throughout his life, he made and lost several fortunes, I think. And at the end of his life, he was really pretty destitute, just living in a little bungalow here in Los Angeles. And the only house that he and Sadie ever owned was out in Vidal, California, which is where the bulk of my book takes place. But, I felt like since his last words are supposed that, and that most of the book is his dream, casting it as a dream gave me a lot of license to play around with facts. Because in real life, the biographer who was by his bedside was John Flood and not Stuart Lake. But for the purposes of my story, it just made more sense to have it be Stuart Lake, since he's the one who's going to mythologize Wyatt. But I feel like if people want the absolute true story, they should read Casey Tefertiller's book. And if they want a novel about someone coming to terms with what their life means at the end of their life, they can read my novel.
I was about to say, that's kind of the theme of the book, really, is like you say, someone coming to terms with their life at the end of it. He's not, a young, robust man. Although, without getting into any spoilers, he does have a bit of action sequence, I guess you could call it, there toward the end of your book. I guess that's all fiction, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The whole Vidal story in the book of his wife and Vidal and getting involved with these other characters is all fiction. I made all of that up. But that was part of the fun of it, was being able to write a kind of traditional, almost John Ford, Anthony Mann type Western story, or Louis L'Amour type, to give a literary reference.
Yeah, did the films have any bearing on what you did in the book?
Yeah, they certainly did. I mean, I went back and rewatched My Darling Clementine, and I mean, you can see the poster behind me here, Gunfight at the OK Corral, the more recent Tombstone and Wyatt Earp movies.
Oh, I love them.
Yeah, so, and it's interesting to see how each of those portrays Wyatt a little differently, and sometimes depending on when they were made. Gunfight at the OK Corral is pretty much just a straight ahead Western and doesn't present Wyatt or Doc Holliday very much as they actually were. My Darling Clementine, also very romanticized. And then those ones before the 1990s, you really don't see Wyatt involved with women very much, or if he is, there's sort of saloon girls or teachers or someone, that he's getting involved with, instead of his wife that he was with when he came to Tombstone, common law wife, who had been a prostitute and was addicted to laudanum. And then while he was there, he got involved with Josephine. And they remained together for the rest of his life.
I always thought Dana Delaney did a really good job as Josephine. I really got the.
Yeah, I think that was one of the highlights of that film.
I think so, yeah.
Which, I mean, it was a film with a lot of highlights. Certainly
Yes.
Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday steals the show.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
But out of all the film portrayals, I'd have to say that, even though the movie itself gets a little comic bookish, I think Kurt Russell's Wyatt Earp is the one that is the most authentic.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
How about the TV series with Hugh O'Brian?
I have to be honest, I've only seen a handful of episodes, and those were as I was finishing the book, and I found it online on streaming. Because when I was growing up, it wasn't syndicated in North Alabama, and I was born just shortly after it went off the air. So that's something I've only seen more recently, and it's pretty well done for a Western TV series. I think it's a kind of stodgy portrayal in a lot of ways of Wyatt, and again, it totally ignores his love life.
Well, and they do try to make it sound like it's historic at the beginning of every episode, over the top of that barbershop quartet hooing and hoeing and all that. Mm-hmm. They make some kind of little narration about the history of the time. And of course, very little of it was actual history of the time.
Well, they do, I think, eventually by the end of the show get into the gunfight at the OK Corral. Yeah. Start way before that when he's a marshal in Dodge City.
Dodge City, yeah.
But Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it was a half-hour show. I think that format of the show owed a lot to radio, because it's
Yes,
a lot of television back then in the 1950s were
did.
basically radio shows adapted to TV, like The Lone Ranger and Superman and even I Love Lucy. Um, but you know, and those very often had that kind of narration at the beginning to kind of set up what you're going to see. Even the Lone Ranger TV show did that. So I think it's just in keeping with that style that was prevalent at the time.
And at the time when they created it, it was claimed to be the first adult Western, meaning it wasn't written and created for kids. It was, for the whole audience. And I think they kind of set the stage for a lot of Westerns that followed.
I I would question that a little bit. I have to think, when did Gunsmoke come to TV?
I'm not sure it was on radio for a long, long time before
It was
that.
on radio for about 20 years, starting in the 30s or 40s, and then came to TV in the 50s. I'm not sure. Wyatt Earp came on in 55. I'm not sure if Gunsmoke predated that or not, but it was around the same time.
At
So
the
yeah,
same time.
but you know, it may have been the first aimed more for adults, because a lot of them, of course, are things like, you know, Gene Autry show and Roy Rogers show, which were definitely just a lot of action, a lot of gunfights. So it was
And
actually,
silliness.
yeah, and the comic sidekicks and all the sort of, you know, Western B movie tropes, you know, mixing kind of modern day with the old West, because Roy's riding his horse and everybody else gets in a car and drives around, you know. So
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. In your book, we see Wyatt riding around in his car, and you don't think of Wyatt Earp driving around in a car, but that's what's going on.
yeah, you know, I had to think a little bit about my grandfather, who was born in the 1890s and died in the 1980s. He had a pretty long life. And again, he was born at a time before automobiles, before airplanes, you know, so in his lifespan, he saw a lot of tremendous changes, you know, to go from the sort of horse and wagon days to the jet age. And I think Wyatt almost did that himself, you know, being born in the 1840s. By the time he dies, there were cars, there were airplanes, or motion pictures. And you know, he even worked on movies. He worked as a consultant on silent films. And John Ford claims that he knew Wyatt Earp very well, and even John Wayne, who gets a sort of hidden mention in the book, because
Yeah,
Wyatt,
you use his actual name.
yeah, Marion Morrison, yeah, but he worked as a prop boy in films when he was just, you know, playing football at USC, and he claims that he not only met Wyatt Earp, but that he sort of patterned his Western cowboy portrayal after Wyatt Earp. So yeah, Wyatt, I think, definitely had some influence, you know, and at his funeral, I mean, Tom Mix and William S. Hart were two of the pallbearers.
Two of the
So
biggest Western stars of their era.
yeah, they were.
Folks, we mentioned Hugh O'Brien's TV show a few times. We want to stick around after we get done talking with Bruce. We're going to reprise a vintage interview I did with Hugh O'Brien before he died. He died in 2016. And man, he had a storied life. You're going to hear all about it here in a little while. But before we do that, I know a lady named Karina Candace who's off in the wings there, chopping at the bit to get in here and talk to Bruce. So, hey, Karina, are you out there?
I am. Hi.
Hello.
So, what I wanted to ask you first, Bruce, is that you did the script, and I'm sure you tried to get producers, directors interested in making the film, and then you decided to do the novel. Now, are you going to carry on trying to submit the script? Is that your goal, is to have that made into a film?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to see it made into a film. Again, it's definitely connecting with people. I think there may be some hesitancy to it because the main characters are both, you know, elderly people.
Oh, yeah.
But you know, one of the most popular shows on TV in recent months was The Old Man with Jeff Bridges. So you know, there are a lot of actors of his generation who I think would love to be in a film where they get to be on screen pretty much the whole time. Because one of the things I figured out when I sat down to write it as a novel, or even as a script, really, is that since the bulk of the story is his dying dream, when we are dreaming, we never dream from any other character's point of view. So at one point I was about to write a scene of the villain sort of off by themselves plotting what they're going to do with Wyatt. And I thought he wouldn't dream that, because he's not in it. He's not involved with that. So the entire script is pretty much from Wyatt's point of view.
I've tried to turn one of my novels into a script, and it's a whole different kind of writing. How did you get on from going from script to novel writing?
This is about my third or fourth attempt at this, because screenplays I can do once I've got the story set, do them pretty quickly. The novel, of course, takes a lot more time. And you're very aware that when you're writing a script, aside from the people making the movie, no one's really going to see that. You know, you're just kind of writing the blueprint for the film. But when you're writing a novel, everyone's going to see it. Everyone's going to see those sentences. So they've really got to work as literature. So that's a little different construct. And also, I've always maintained that short stories make better movies than novels, because a short story you can tell the whole thing. With a novel, you got to pick and choose and cut it down. And if you've ever taken one of your scripts and literally converted it into prose, you'll see you've got about 40,000 words, or not even that, about 25,000 words usually. Whereas your normal novel is 65 to 70,000,
Yeah,
So,
it's well
that
cut up.
That is why in the novel of the story, there's a lot more of Wyatt's backstory and Sadie's backstory than there is in the screenplay.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for being on the show and chatting with us. It's been wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, sometime we'll come back and talk about your Matt Helm book. I just read that just a couple of weeks ago, and I really enjoyed it. But it doesn't really dovetail very easily in with Wyatt Earp. So I figured, well, I'll put that aside.
Except that Donald Hamilton, who wrote the Matt Helm stories, also wrote the book that became the film The Big Country.
Oh, really?
Yep.
There's always that 6 degrees of separation that comes in there.
We were talking about John Wayne saying he was influenced by Wyatt Earp in his Western portrayal. In his last film, The Shootist, he shot down at the end of the film by Hugh O'Brian.
Oh, okay.
So Wyatt Earp is the one who kills him at the end, more or less.
Well, all right. Well, I think we covered The Last Stand pretty well and introduced folks to a very interesting read. I really enjoyed the novel. And I hope you guys stick around and meet the most famous Wyatt Earp actor, I guess. Yeah, that's it, the actor, Hugh O'Brian, because he's got some stories to tell about Albert Schweitzer and creating the phrase "oorah," and losing his hearing because he worked on the set of Wyatt Earp. Lots of other stuff. So don't go anywhere, folks. We've got more Wyatt Earp coming your way.
Wyatt Earp, Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold. Long live his fame, and long live his glory, and long may his story be told.
Ah, yes, Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold. You know, I always wondered about that lyric. Don't brave, courageous, and bold mean exactly the same thing? Well, of course, that's the theme song from The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp that ran from 1955 to 1961, starring Hugh O'Brian, who is, at the age of 89, now an author of his memoir, Hugh O'Brian, or What's Left of Him. And it is chock full of stories, folks. I've read the book, and I can tell you that, well, it's got 2 introductions by Debbie Reynolds and Hugh Hefner. It's stories of a young 4-year-old entrepreneur who sold secondhand newspapers to get penny candy, who was the youngest drill sergeant in Marine Corps history and coined the phrase "oorah." He was discovered by, I guess, Ida Lupino, and that launched his Hollywood career, which ended up with The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, but many, many other stage and screen and television appearances. So we got lots of folks that will maybe mention along the way, like playing craps with Lyndon Johnson, or meeting Elvis and the Beatles, or thought of being teamed up with Buddy Hackett in a comedy routine, to starring in Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger, to Danny DeVito, to his meeting with Albert Schweitzer and what that led to. So we probably won't get to all of that, but we're going to give it a try with the legendary Hugh O'Brien. So hello, Hugh. Welcome.
Well, thank you. How are
tell
you?
the folks. I'm doing excellent. Now, folks, Hugh has got a hearing impairment that might impact how we go along, and that's a direct result of his time on Wyatt Earp. Can you share with the folks how that came about, Hugh?
We did about 350 rounds of ammunition every day. And I think you know that when you see a film or TV and there is gunfire, they dub in that full load. But when you film it, nobody can handle the sound too well, so they use what we call quarter loads. But I really wanted to make the Wyatt Earp series as authentic as possible, so I insisted on using a full load. And the crew behind the camera wore earplugs. The guy in front of me wasn't going to be there the next day anyway. But there was really a huge difference between a quarter load being fired at the opposition compared to the full load. And the reaction, next time you watch part of the series or whatever, the reaction was really double what it would normally be. But anyway, now I'm paying for it because I lost a lot of my hearing.
Now, can you tell us how you got into the Marine Corps? Was it true that you really coined the phrase "oorah"?
Did I get in? I ran in. I enlisted in Chicago. My great-grandfather was a Marine. My grandfather was a Marine. My dad was a Marine. He was a Marine in World War I, and he kept his status with the Marine Corps and was put in charge, and the major of the 9th Battalion Reserve out of Chicago. Went into the Marine Corps. Right out of boot camp, they made me honor man of my boot camp in San Diego, and made me a drill instructor at age 17. So I am, and still am, the youngest DI, the youngest drill instructor in Marine Corps history. Have you ever heard the Marines do ooh-ah?
Of course. How did that come about?
I'm the one that taught them to do that. One way or the other, I told them some of the things that we were, going to be doing. I said, I'm going to give you 3 potty breaks a day. 3 times to go to the toilet, which you know what it is, and we call it a head. Yep. 3 times during the day. Now, if you have to go in between one of those, you got to go. And I'll certainly let you go. But you're going to be separated from us. So I need to know when you're coming out. So as you get up from the toilet, let me hear it. Ooh-ah! And that's how it began.
Tell the folks how Ida Lupino helped get your career going.
One of the things that I did in the Marine Corps when I first got out, I had little cards made up that said exterior decorator, which was a fancy word for a guy that mowed lawns. And she was one of my first customers. And one way or the other, I started doing different things as a hobby, and one of them I had met this gal that was doing a little theater production, and I went to the rehearsals with her, and the second night the leading man didn't show up, and the director said, why don't you read his role? And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? She said, well, first of all, turn the damn script upside around. You got it upside down. Anyway, I read the role, and anyway, Lana Ida Lupino happened to come and see the show, and invited me to come to her office the next day.
Now, Debbie Reynolds had something to do with your career. You taught her how to kiss, right?
She's one of the greatest ladies that ever came around. She was under contract at MGM, and she said, why don't you come out, since you like it as a hobby, why don't you come on out to Metro and let me introduce you to a couple of people. So I did, and she introduced me to 2 or 3 different producers and so forth. And within about 2 or 3 weeks, I got my first job. And that was the beginning.
Well, tell the folks how you came to be Wyatt Earp and you're the one that chose the outfit, and you had a lot to do with the shaping of the first adult Western, right?
One of the people whose lawn I was doing was a man by the name of Stuart Lake. And Stuart basically wrote the book on Wyatt Earp. They sent me to Wardrobe and Western Costume Company. And they had picked out this outfit, which was even more colorful than Gene Autry. It had polka dot shirt, it had a white hat, it had striped pants, and a gold vest that had little diamonds in it. And I said, wait a minute, man. We're doing a show about a man who actually lived. And I'm going to wear what he did, which was he wore the same type of frock coat and wardrobe that the judge wore, or the mayor, or a business owner. And that's what he wore. So I said, that's what I'm going to wear. So the outfit that I picked out, it's still a Western-looking outfit, but it's more of a businessman type of wardrobe of that period. But it worked. It really did.
Yeah, because the Wyatt Earp, the series, as they say, is kind of the first adult Western that was on TV. One thing I remember is that it had a lot of recurring storylines that kind of ran through it that people could see on the DVD if they check it out. Now, throughout your career, you knew your guns and you did a lot of stunt work too, right?
Well, stunt, we had a full-time 2, 3 stuntmen. At least 2 of them were there all the time. And that's the way things were operated back in it. And all the stunts, they would be choreographed by the stuntman, all the fights, and then they would actually put on the wardrobe of the leading man or whoever was in the fight, and then they would film that sequence, but not with the real actor that was doing the role. And I said, well, that's bull. I'm going to do my own stunts. And the stuntmen thought I was nuts. And towards the beginning, they decided that they'd get rid of this guy's ability to do that. And they put in stunts that were really, really tough. One of them, for instance, was going out of a second-story window. that I want to do it because I don't want the crew to have to reshoot a sequence using the double for the stunts. And I, for 7 years, did my own stunts on the show. But it really made a difference because they could come in close, and it was pretty obvious that was me either getting hit or hitting somebody else. And we did some very, very rough stunts. But that was part of the business from my point of view.
Well, to shift gears, tell the folks about meeting Albert Schweitzer and what that led to.
Well, number one, I had read quite a bit about that man, as well as other dignitaries or world leaders. I was always interested from the time I was about 4 or 5 years old of reading about people that were running the world, so to speak. And I decided I really wanted to go visit this man. And Norman Cousins had just written this wonderful book about him. I read that. And one day I got this letter from Schweitzer that invited Dr. O'Brien to come visit him. And that had been the result of Norman Cousins telling him about me and my desire to see him. Anyway, it took about 3-4 different planes to get to that little clinic. Some of the lepers met me at the plane when I got. Took me down to the Ugawaga River. They put me into this, what they called a pirogue, which was actually a very large war canoe cut out of a huge oak tree. He helped me out of it. Pirogue was kind of like Dr. Schweitzer, I presume. Took me to his cabin or hut, and it was every night that I was there for about 9 days. Every night I would never have less than 3 hours sitting with this man in his hut talking about any kind of a subject you can imagine. And it was such a great learning experience to me. Well, first of all, on the plane, coming back, I decided that I had to try to create something that would make or break by my own efforts that would be useful to civilization. And I decided to work with young people, and I focused in my mind on which year was the most changeable, which year was the most important to me at high school. And it was my sophomore year, 10th grade, where I realized that what it was to make a buck and how important it was to get a good education and then really become devoted to whatever discipline you decided to start with. And I got off the plane, and within a week, 10 days later, I had my first group of young people. I focused on 10th graders, as I said, because you have 2 years left in high school to refocus on who you are, what you really want to be, and how to go at it, and why an education, a college education, is so important in terms of helping you get where you want to go. And I now have, I guess, a little over 600,000 that have been through the program. We have the Hobie program now in every state. Every state has a minimum of one. Connecticut, Rhode Island, District of Columbia, they can get all their high schools into one or two locations. But the majority of schools have to have 3, 4, 5 places where young people go geographically within the state. Then they select 2, 3, 4 from each of those sites to go to our World Congress. And this coming year, in the late spring, early summer, they will attend at Loyola University in Chicago for the second time. And Loyola will help organize that program, and they will be helpful in putting the program together. What subjects, and they're all, well, it's probably, there's no less than a 14-hour day. And what I would suggest is that you and anybody else that might be listening, please do me the honor of looking at the Hobie website. That's www.hobie, HOBY.org. Hobie is short for my name, Hugh O'Brien Hughes. The other that I would appreciate you're looking at, which you might have fun looking at, is my personal website in terms of what I've done or haven't done, and that's HughO'Brien.me. HughO'Brien.me, M-E. And then, of course, I would enjoy hearing from anybody that wants to write me. And I have a book that I did, which just came out a few months ago, which pretty well tells the story of my life and also some thoughts I have about the future.
We didn't even scratch the tip of the iceberg for what's in that book, but I do hope you'll check it out if you're interested in Wyatt Earp and show business and the Hopi youth leadership and all the advice that Hugh has for young people in the book.